Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Urban Fae, The Geas, Part 3, by Bear 64, a.k.a. Michael Lockhart. Eventually we began to see more structures, and more of them approaching the verge of the lane we followed. As a result, I could see that most of the workers were indeed humans of some sort, not too prepossessing, and most would not look up at us. Other folk appeared in various forms, some anthropomorphic and others not. There was a definite reptilian theme, sinuous bodies attracting the eye and snatches of sibilant speech in an odd language tempering the ear. There were definitely some mini sauropods in the fields. I'd long lost any shock at weird creatures, but seeing wee dinosaurs pulling plows was a little amusing. The thoughts raised my spirits, though only briefly. Once more a question arose. Grandfather, I note that the folk in this realm tend towards reptilian, at least in appearance, yet those that attacked the circle at Beltane were different. They possessed a hint of avian character. Are they allies with one another or something else? I'd gotten over my reactions to calling a man grandfather who appeared to be in his early to mid-20s, not that much older than me. It helped that his eyes had a depth and a sorrow to them that spoke of a long life indeed. He turned to me with the faintest upward twitches at the corner of his mouth, in the otherwise grim features. I suspected that he liked the question. The realms tend towards one type of folk or another, though there are always captives, refugees, and a handful of immigrants from other places and worlds. Those that attacked the Beltane dance were called Hutao among themselves, and certain cultures in Mundania. They are often employed as mercenaries for raids. They are related to goblins of the darker variety. They can move through the forest by ways of the limbs and stems that interlace far above the floor of green spaces. They are fearsome, as you discovered, but not overtly brave, and they fight effectively only in packs. They have some avian qualities. You may have noted that they had feathers and down instead of fur or hair. Using them was intended to disguise the culprit, but you have already discovered the source of malice towards you. I looked at him in surprise. I did? I don't recall naming any suspects. His lips twitched upwards once more. You spoke in your fever. You gave the name Serpentina, a sobriquet for one of the chief servants of one of the major powers in Underworld. On that note, I'll remind you that Coyote is already in use, so you will want to start thinking of yourself as Wolfling or Robert of the Wolf Clan. He probably wouldn't care much. After all, there are only so many names to be had. He might even find it amusing. But calling the name of a power may call that power. He's not one whom we wish to become entangled. Back to Serpentina on this side. He will have scales over his body, but his head is covered in blooms, dark red, and his scales are silver white. By Fae standards, he's considered quite handsome, yet likes to eat human flesh and drink their blood. It's in his nature, considering who his father is. That's always the real danger. We fight one another in this world, yet we must take care in what feuds we become entangled. A fight is between individuals, but a feud will entangle entire clans for generations. Our clan is very powerful, but not the strongest by far. I say that with no shame. Serpentine's clan has many adherents and descendants, and may once again be on the rise among mortals. I believe that we may have a slight advantage, but I'd never make assumptions. He grew quiet again as the top of a gleaming hill rose directly in our path. It was coppery gold in the noon sun. As we proceeded, the hill rose from the horizon, and the next step of it was more gold than red. The following was even more so. Steps, I realized. This was no hill. It was one of those American stepped pyramids. By the time we drew close enough to view the entire structure, there were 5 tiers visible. I'd seen pictures of something like this built near Mexico City in Mundania. That one had been all stone and charcoal gray, yet it had possessed much less foreboding than this gleaming but gloomy edifice. Despite it being used for human sacrifice, we had made no attempt at stealth, so I assumed we'd be starting with the direct approach. I shuddered with thoughts of sweet Sorsha being held captive in this pile of misery. She was so very strong, but something in me rebelled at the thought of my lady being held against her will. I found it repugnant, and I intended her succor. There I was having noble thoughts again. I was ruined for criminal enterprises. Or so I thought. As we approached the pyramid, soldiers in red, white, and gold armor appeared and lined the avenue. They carried big, flat wooden cricket bats with sharp chunks of volcanic glass attached to the edges. I would once have considered such Stone Age weaponry to be greatly inferior, but I'd learned that in the hands of an expert warrior, just about anything could be deadly. The troops simply lined the avenue and watched. A few carried spears and bows rather than the paddle swords, but they held them the way modern Mundania soldiers hold weapons when they drill. There were quite a few, more than the big bad wolf and I combined could take. I never actually seen him fight, but the odds were impossible, higher fey or not. We drew close to the base of the step structure before anyone challenged us. A tall figure, resplendent in gold armor, with a white cape at his shoulders and a headpiece crested in scarlet blooms, stepped in front of the entrance, a square hole in the direct center of the base. It appeared to be an insert porch, with the door tucked beneath the shadows. Beside the tall chieftain stood another figure. At first I thought it was a man with a weird mask and a feathered cloak, but I quickly realized that it was some sort of anthropomorph avian being. I mentally shrugged. It was getting easier every moment to accept weird stuff. The chieftain spoke. "Greetings, Mac Tirmor. What brings you to the exalted residence of the most mighty son of the plumed serpent?" The big bad wolf drew himself to his full height, easier now that the chariot was no longer rolling. I sat as tall in the saddle as I could manage. I still thought it was weird how quickly I'd taken to horseback riding. It seemed as natural as walking to me. It helped that the mount was highly intelligent and well-trained. Grandfather spoke in loud but measured tones. "Greeting, chieftain of the Golden Gate. We seek audience with your master. We believe that he may have information for us about a lost comrade. Will you allow us entrance to treat with him, or shall we roast in the sun?" The chieftain smiled with unconcealed malice. "You will do as my master bids. You are fortunate, however, since he has recently returned from a foray abroad. He is in a receptive mood and perhaps will not keep you waiting long. About that time, the door of the pyramid swung open enough to allow a thin being to emerge. It approached the chieftain and spoke to him in a low voice. The chieftain nodded. You are most fortunate. My lord will deign to speak with you. You will have to do without shade, unless you have brought your own. He comes shortly to the entrance. With a broader and even nastier smile, he stepped to one side and the feathered parrot guy stepped to the other. The doors opened inside the gloom cast by the short tunnel of the portal to the pyramid doorway. A throne appeared, and the doors swung shut to provide a backdrop. Upon the throne sat a man, possibly a fae of similar type to our own. He was shockingly pale, and his hair, maybe feathers, was a red the color of dried blood. I couldn't clearly discern his features, but they seemed to bear a different cast than that of my clan folk. His eyes glittered from the darkness and pierced each of us in turn. He exuded malice and power, a being in his own realm and in his own ruling seat. Eventually, his eyes settled on the old wolf. It has been some time since our last meeting, Tyree. Despite the cause of that encounter, I give you greetings and courtesy. What would you have of me? I noticed that his voice was higher pitched than I would have thought. It carried well, though with an odd quality, as though he favored the consonants and chewed his words before allowing them to pass his almost non-existent lips. I'd learned something new, my grandfather's given name. The Mock Timor was apparently accustomed to these drawn-out courtesies and word games. I fairly seethed with anger. I only wanted to see Sorsha and know that she was well. I managed to choke down an interruption. I knew that would be counterproductive, but holding my tongue at that moment was one of the most difficult tasks I'd ever endeavored to undertake. I chuckled internally, imagining myself clutching the tip of my tongue between my thumb and forefinger. I had to entertain myself when I was stressed. I almost missed Grandfather's retort. Chief Serpentine, one of my associates, has been taken against her will. Though she was only a minor member of an allied clan, she was under my protection, so I feel obligated to retrieve her. I thought that perhaps with your great wisdom, perhaps you might offer advice on her whereabouts. After all, your knowledge of the lands is extensive. That was almost too much. Flattery to this turd, this Sorsha napper? I choked back comments. I'm sure the apoplectic fury fairly shone in my features. The feathered-head scoundrel detected my scowl and the burning scarlet that had flushed my features. I got a glimmer of teeth. Maybe fangs. Perhaps a malignant grin and a few answering sparks in his eyes. I see your kinsman struggles to maintain courtesy, though he is very young and perhaps untutored in civilized manners. Mac Timor remained cool. He didn't even glance at me. He's learning rapidly, and his skills may surprise those who would meddle in various worlds. Now, as to the matter of my servant, she was taken at a Beltane dance in breach of custom and the bands of peace. Her captors took her by way of a water portal. By all indications, It exited at your lake. There was indeed a large body of water to one side of the pyramid. It was almost concealed by rainforest growth and the bulk of the gigantic structure, but appeared to be extensive, a lake rather than a pool or pond. Perhaps you or one of your people saw something useful? The last was clearly a statement rather than a question. Serpentine understood the implication. I will inquire. I certainly do not wish to have one of your folk loose in my lands, even involuntarily. I'm sure that she means no harm, but we have not been friends. And her captors clearly bear malice to both of us, since bringing her here would implicate me or mine in the plot. These are, after all, troubling times, as times always are in Otherworld. He was clearly dissembling and intended to cover his tracks, but I'd heard a key word, captors, rather than captor. I hoped that my grandpa had wolf ears to go with the other paraphernalia. The wolf mumbled, Indeed, those who took her fall under the law of hot pursuit. I cheered internally. Of course he picked up the verbal clue and thrown it back at Snaky Bird Boy. You are welcome to join our chase, but mostly I ask leave to continue it myself in your lands. Serpentine smiled in that cold manner of his. I saw no flame on your spear. I heard not the ringing of your herald horns. So it appears you have failed to follow the rules of the law of hot pursuit. However, I will take you at your word and treat your approach as a visit rather than a challenge. You will never have leave to freely roam my lands, any more than you would allow me to rove yours. I have informed you that the kidnappers fall under my concern and watch. My people will find them if they are in my realm. Out of courtesy to you as a fellow chief, I will send word if we find them, or the person or remains of your servant. With that, we were clearly dismissed. The doors opened and his throne receded, and the doors closed with more certainty than they opened. Before they did, I thought I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, once again large, slithered past the opening. I was too angry to react. Besides, there had to be other snake chicks in a lair like this one. I was fit to burst. What was that bit about finding remains? I sensed that the Mac Timur understood some things that I did not, and when his chariot wheeled around to leave, I turned my own mount and followed in silence, teeth grinding in frustration. I soon found that the chariot sped ahead. I saw my grandfather sprint forward along the pole to crouch for a moment between the horses. Then, to my amazement and lasting admiration, he sprang into the air and backflipped back into his original space on the chariot, just behind the driver. Guerrer did not rein in the horses during the maneuver or afterwards, but instead urged them to greater speed. I did not have to encourage my own speed. He leapt forward, and we left the guards that lined the avenue choking with the dust from the wheels and hooves. I know that gesture may have seemed petty, but in Otherworld, a warrior must display his superior skills. My 20-something appearing grandfather assured me as we headed back towards the crossroads. You were born chariot rank. It's a skill set that you must eventually learn. You'll have to find a suitable team and a charioteer who would take service with you. In the meantime, it appears that you and your mount have accepted one another. He is now yours, if he consents." My horse whickered softly and nodded. Apparently, I was an acceptable rider. "You must now provide a name by which you call him. He has his own, but unless you learn to speak Equinese, it will have to be something in common tongue that is agreeable to the both of you." I thought for a moment. I had a buddy in Mundania. His name was Lemongello, but I called him L. "I don't want to call you L," I said to the horse. He was a smart dude and tough, but you are too magnificent for such a thing. In response, he raised his front feet and pranced for a few paces, then whinnied in laughter. "You have a similar sense of humor to L. Maybe something with bike. We both rode bikes exceedingly well. If you ever travel to Mundania with me, we'll have to glamour you as something, and a bike might work on occasion. You are fast enough to be a motorbike. Sounds too short to be a full name, though. Maybe..." I rubbed my chin, as I like to do when I pretended to think deeply. "Mighty Bike? MB for short? The way L was L?" My mount trotted quietly for a moment, and then nodded again with a little whinnied laughter regarding some internal joke. I looked over at Gingerbeard, grandfather. "So what now? If Sorsha is back in the pyramid, shouldn't we be making plans to rescue her? If not, why bother with letting Serpentine know what we know?" The big bad wolf spared me a glance. "She's not in the pyramid, though she may still be in this realm. Search your feelings. Extend your thoughts to her. Call to her. If she's near, perhaps she will find a way to answer." I couldn't believe he was giving me the wise master yogi routine. However, he was not one to joke often, and he was usually rather obvious when he did, as though he'd been misunderstood once too often. What the heck, I decided. I closed my eyes and thought about my Sorsha. That was easy. I thought about her most of the time these days, to the point of distraction, more often than not. However, I realized that he had meant to think of her very directly, very clearly, to concentrate on nothing but her. I pictured her, not just her physical nature, but I envisioned her sweet and sour and sometimes weird demeanor, her intelligence, her warmth, her care for my well-being. And there she was, clear as day and as real as anything I could have seen with my eyes wide open. She was in a dimly lit room. The light wavered in a weird, dreamlike manner, like it was filtered through water. The lights were reddish, no, greenish, yellow, blue, purple. That was it. There were artificial wave lights, like in Sony's trashy club. Dancer lights. She wasn't dancing, though. She stood against a wall with her arms out to either side. Chained. "Sorsha!" Apparently I called not only in my mind, but aloud, very aloud, since MB reared his head and both Grandpa and Greer whipped their heads towards me, startled. As the vision had faded, I saw her look up at me, look into my eyes, and smile. Maybe the picture was severed and I could not get it back, no matter how hard I concentrated. "Give that up, lad. You have seen what you needed to see, and now you are blocked. In which world is she held?" I sat in sullen silence for a moment, gaining control of my anger that she'd been in bonds. "I think it may be in Mundania. Maybe in Sony's club? At first I thought she was underwater, but that was just a trick." He nodded. "Mayhaps. Or just as likely, a trick within a trick. And she was truly underwater." I thought about that and at last decided No, they would not be stupid enough to put her in or near that element that gives her the most power. Maybe, but it just doesn't feel right. They've circled on us, taken her to Mundania, or never left in the first place. While we've been here wasting our time, after days here, she could have been in misery for weeks or months in that place. I have to get home and find her. I saw that he was grinning like a happy wolf, one that was hunting, preparing to catch and devour prey. Wolfling. The time passes differently, but not always the way you've experienced them thus far. There is a portal at the crossroads. Since it resides on the border, time will distort differently, and we will have to decide on a dark or light exit. You do understand that dark or light is different than good or evil on this side. It has more to do with methodology than intrinsic value. We Fae all love our chaos and fun, yet we mostly follow the laws, which provide a framework, if not a full structure, in which our societies operate. So now we have to decide whether to go cautiously or whether to take some risks. I have begun this quest with you, so we will continue it together. Let's hasten in any case. Hasten we did, and when we reached the crossroads, he spoke briefly with Geas and then to his horse team. They all seemed to be agreeable, even enthusiastic. Then he looked at me. Well, aren't you going to ask Mighty Bike whether he will accompany you? MB looked at me and grinned and gave the horse equivalent of an eyebrow waggle. Sometime soon, I'd have to ask Grandpa how this horse traveled to Mundania to watch TV. Thanks, MB. I knew I could count on you. I looked over at the Mactir Moor and Geas. Thank you. To you and your team. My lord, I could ask for no nobler companions. I may not have known much about the Fae, tricks and magicish stuff, but I'd learned the lingo quickly, as I had learned that of scholars and turds in Mundania, language was the smoothest path to gain what I wanted. Should we take a moment to change our attire? The Mactir Moor and Geas stared at me a moment. Then the big man grumbled. No need to do things the hard way. We haven't really practiced, but since you did so well on tracking your lady, I will give you a brief instruction on casting a glamour. It's one of the most basic tools we have, and you should have learned it long ago. It was indeed easy, just a matter of concentration. Much like looking for Sorsha, he warned me that it would have to be renewed each time I slept and awakened. So, what do we go as? And where should we land or enter? My grandfather stared once more. I'm the expert in Otherworld. You are the expert in Mundania. What do you recommend, Wolfling? I thought for a moment. I'm tired of caution. I think we need some action. The visit with Serpentine did not seem to rattle him, so maybe it's time to shake up the opposition. Put them on their heels, whether it's flying snakes or something else. The Mactir Moor and Geas both managed wolfish grins. Guess it was in their DNA. I saw it as approval and the action the old wolf would have recommended. We started forward towards the portal. Part of my recent experience had been learning to identify portals. Once I'd learned to see rather than to merely look, they became quite apparent. Shimmering lines of various sizes, colors, shapes, and in various positions. Grandfather had warned that they sometimes appeared on the ground and accounted for at least some disappearances from bogs and boulder fields on both sides. We arrived on the edge of Centennial Park. I'd learned that there were Centennial Parks in almost every city that had existed for a century or more, so the place was even less exceptional than I'd already deemed it. It was early evening and more cars drove by than I would have expected. The place had changed. More of the urbanistas had invaded since I'd last visited. The nearby residents had vacated for less green but safer pastures. Now, instead of families and walking pets, there were dope slingers and thugs. Even the structures that lined the avenue around the green space, mostly older homes, had deteriorated noticeably. Many gapped with empty windows and missing doors, and not a few had been damaged or destroyed by fire. Every surface seemed to be covered with graffiti and tags. I thought that we must have been gone for months for such a drastic transition. However, my internal calendar clock combination, a skill that went with identifying and entering portals on purpose, informed me that it was only May 2nd. I wasn't sure that I'd ever grown accustomed to the inconsistency in the passage of time. I realized that I hadn't been to the park since Samhain the previous year. The big man in the chariot had become a sleek limousine with an open top for most observers. I could see it as translucent outline over the reality. MB projected the look of a three-wheeler roadster, the kind I'd had in mind to purchase, with the two wheels in front and one behind, from a new company, Trinity Roadsters. I think MB would have liked it if he could have seen it. Maybe he'd seen commercials? I kept it basic black like his glistening coat. There was not enough room to ride side by side in the two imaginary vehicles, so as the guide I took the lead. It was just as well, since we'd arrived in start of a hood rat storm. One of the streets had been blocked off for racing, and we could see, hear, and smell the festivities as engines roared, tires melted, and the audience cheered or groaned and occasionally fired off a pistol round in celebration. Disappointment, or perhaps the settling of bets. The street on which we'd arrived was across the green space from the impromptu drag strip, and less heavily traveled, or at least navigated at lesser velocities. It was apparent, aside for the cruising and the display of ridiculous paint jobs and accessories. No sooner had we arrived than the blare of horns sounded behind the Mac Tyrmore's chariot, and screamed invectives issued from within the gaudy, bedecked sedan when the driver had to brake. The horses snorted and reared a little. To onlooking mortals, they would have seemed like revved engines. Based on the responses from our horses, the sound of the car horn must have been similar to war trumpets, and grandfather had told me that they enjoyed a good fight as much as he or his charioteer. You may have heard the expression, "Don't poke the bear." The same applies to the big bad wolf. Guerrero whirled the chariot around and into the opposite lane in a shorter radius than I'd have imagined possible. MB paid attention and wheeled, only we stayed in the same lane to face down the approaching hoodmobile. The front passenger had seated himself in the open window and attempted to maneuver a small submachine gun onto the roof of the car so that it would point to what he saw as a high-end limo with tinted glass. The driver couldn't make up his mind whether to watch where he was going or try to swerve towards the chariot. So he jerked the steering wheel to either side and his vehicle swerved like a serpent having a fit. I used my knees to steer MB towards the passenger side. I drew the 3-foot-long broadsword attached to MB's saddle. I had yet to master the lance and horsebow, and Grandpa had insisted that it would be more effective than my short sword from horseback. As we passed the car going the opposite direction, I sliced off the gunman's head. It was my first decapitation, and due to luck as much as skill, a bright splash of gore fountained, a little splattered on my arm and MB's tail, but with our forward momentum combined with that of the turdmobile proceeding in the opposite direction, we missed most of the gushing fluid. I tucked my elbow to maintain control of the weapon and continued to parallel the chariot over in the opposite lane. I glanced over at my grandfather, who wore an expression of rage and pride combined. I know he'd wanted the kill, but it made more sense for me to remove the problem in the moment. Besides, the driver had now spun his own car. I looked over my shoulder and saw the body of the shooter flung from its perch to join its head, which had finally stopped rolling down the gutter and now stared up at the windows of a vacant house that stared back, each gaping with surprise at their fate. But I couldn't help but laugh. "I bet your mother told you to stay out of the gutter." It wasn't my best line, but MB was polite enough to laugh. Besides, his sense of humor tended towards the morbid. The back windows of the gangster's vehicle disappeared into the doors, and two more soldiers emerged with firearms pointed and flames blazing from the red-hot muzzle as molten lead was flung in all directions. These were typical hood rats, no fire discipline or training, just unrighteous drug-fueled fury backed by too much ammo and too long without consequences. Guerrer turned the chariot and we grinned at one another as we crossed paths. And I once again turned towards the passenger side. And this time, the Mac Tirmor faced the driver as he wanted, with both vehicles headed in a straight line, no swerving. As I completed my second decapitation, I was able to glance the big man in action at last. It would have made sense to ram his lance through the front windshield and skewer the pig driver, even though it would leave the backseat shooter in play. Instead, he ran out along the pole and lunged his spear into the turd's throat, then dragged the edge of the blade across the eyes of the shooter. He held the shield that had been mounted on the chariot to his left in his left hand, and it easily fended off the rounds that came towards him and his team. As the thug leaned back from the pain in his face and the sudden blindness, the rim of the shield slammed under his chin and his head snapped back as his body tumbled into the street. The horses then got in a short trample, and Greer managed to steer a wheel over the sprawling body. It was an internal decapitation, so much cleaner than a sword-hewn wound. Internal applause for Gramps. We were now pointed in the original direction we'd intended to take. So we kept going. The shouts and yells of anger and terror faded behind us. Typically, the gang trash would remonstrate loudly, but had taken no interest in taking action that might put their own necks at risk, literally in this case. They bleated and barked amongst one another for days, but should any authorities arrive, no one would have seen a thing. Besides, it takes a while to describe action. It only takes seconds for it to occur. The speed of combat is always disconcerting, and the incident was over before anyone could effectively aim a camera phone or firearm, or even truly comprehend what had happened. The primary cause for upset had been that the driverless vehicle plowed into another in the opposite lane and caused terrific damage to the chassis. I glanced at the limo. Of course, I could clearly see the chariot. Everyone, including the horses, was grinning that wolfish grin once more with the pure delight of mayhem accomplished. "Lord Wolf, we need to get to Sony's crappy club ASAP," I called over to the happier warriors. I'd have to process the battle after we'd tried to rescue Sorsha. Grandfather winked at me and nodded. Lead the way, Wolfling. We parked just down the block and around the corner from the main entrance to BAE View. We had to avoid the valet parking attendants as we needed to approach with some caution. We paused to adjust our glamours and gear. I kept in mind the same, but until now, the MacTier Moore had been hidden by the limo illusion. He stayed pretty much the same, just an adjustment to clothing. His bristling coiffure was plenty menacing. We just added a tailor-made suit and allowed the golden rings he wore on his arms and the massive torque around his neck to show through. He looked like the scary and exotic mother we needed him to appear. I think Sony will assume you are the assassin that he thinks took out Jaguar and the crew. That could be helpful. He's stupid but cautious. I know that scared people do stupid stuff. But in this case, a little fear might get him to talk. He certainly wasn't scared of me the last time we spoke. The wolfish grin remained, and my grandpa gave another nod as he looked over at me. Over, not down. Had I grown? Or was it just some part of the glamour seeping through into my perception? It was a little disconcerting that he'd been so agreeable this evening. Before we go, I noted an item in your case that you will want. I meant to tell you earlier. It would have helped. I haven't been to Mundania in a while. I didn't expect the criminals to have those lead-spitting weapons, but they put you at grave risk. Like most of the other items, it belonged to your father. He favored the target style rather than the big hex like mine. I looked at him stupidly for a short moment, a little angry that he had sorted through my stuff while I was out of action. Then I recalled the piece of coffee table. I removed it, and the wolfish grin on my closest living relative widened yet again. It is a well-made piece. You will want to carry it in your left hand or attach it to your belt. There's a lever on the back. Thumb that, and you will have a round shield that will stop the bullets of the mortals. Apologies for forgetting it earlier. I am happy you were not injured. He looked over at MB. And you as well, Mighty Bike. I hope that you are not angry with an old, forgetful wolf. MB glared for a moment, then snorted laughter. He really was a warped equine, but I was glad he was on our side. As we drew near, I saw that Biggie S was outside with a few of the standard crew members. Papa Boo Boo was likely inside on close watch with Sony. More soldiers out than usual. Sony's nervous about something. I can't believe that he'd knowingly kidnapped Sorsha. He's about as clueless as a gang leader can be, and still get the job done. It was likely a trick to show her being here, maybe to keep us from allying with his crew, but I don't know where else to start. So quoth, this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.